Welcome to Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we talk about using trauma responsive practices to build criminal justice reform. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and today I'm joined by two guests. If y'all want to introduce yourselves.
My name is Lucy Lewis.
And I'm Tony Holloway.
Thank y'all for joining me today. So today we're going to be talking about racial and cultural trauma in policing. So there is a long-standing history with certain groups that have had negative interactions with law enforcement throughout history. And these groups, generally are groups from different cultures and also typically Black and brown communities that have had, pretty negative kind of interactions with law enforcement across the grand scheme. And if we even talk about the roots of policing, people date early law enforcement to slave patrols. And so this becomes difficult for these particular communities to kind of digest that law enforcement were originally established for the purpose of patrolling slaves and returning slaves to owners. And it creates kind of, difficulties in these interactions. And so it's bringing a lot of the trauma that occurred years and years in the past into all of the interactions that law enforcement are having with individuals that are members of these communities, right? And so it kind of sets up interactions with members of communities that are from different cultural backgrounds. Maybe they're immigrant communities, or they practice different religions, whatever it may be, that creates a lot of tension going into these interactions. And so today, what we're kind of talking about is the way that kind of trauma, and we're talking about like generational trauma, the trauma that these individuals have experienced with their interactions with policing. So when we think about trauma within this context, we're talking about individuals who are a part of Black and brown communities have no doubt had a lot of interactions, and a lot of those interactions are negative across the grand scheme. So we're talking about their grandparents, their great grandparents, their mothers, their fathers, their siblings. They're having heightened interactions, higher levels of interactions. And a lot of times these are negative, in addition to when you pair that with the things that they see in the media, where there are negative interactions with law enforcement. And these happen to be individuals that are members of their own community, right? So when we talk about this as law enforcement, is this something that you talk about? Is this something that you communicate about, you're aware of? Can you kind of tell us a little bit about your views on that?
So it is something that we talk about, but then, like you said, it's a cultural thing because the officers and the community have seen so much on TV, movies, or whatever. So that's where they get their background from. So you really got to do a deeper dive. And I guess, like I said, I'm kind of been doing this for 40 years, so I've seen it go from one end to the other end. So, excuse me. So back in the 70s, back in the late 70s, early 80s, you saw where law enforcement and the minority community were starting to work together. It was starting to get that blend. And that was because in today, so I'm going to go back and forth. So in today, only time you see a law enforcement officer in your community, in a Black and brown community, is they're going to go in that community, they're going to make an arrest, and they're going to leave. And you're not going to see them again. So therefore, it's negative. The only time I see an officer in my community is he's there to arrest a family member. He's there to yell and scream at someone, a family member, but I never see him or her just come and talk to someone. So that's what they see today. Go back in the 70s where officers were starting to interact. They were actually getting out and talking to the kids. That's one reason why I want to become a law enforcement officer, because I met a law enforcement officer and he instilled something in me and I said, I want to do that. But then in the late 80s, something happened to the community of color. Crack cocaine came along.
Mm-hmm.
Crack changed the whole way community policing. The crack came into the community of color. So then we said there's war.
Mhm.
So the only thing we knew then was to go back to the old practice that we would go in, take everybody to jail, because that's the problem. That's the way we're going to solve the problem. We're going to arrest everybody.
Mhm.
So every time they saw an officer come into the community, they were there to arrest someone.
And this is kind of what has created this trauma racially and culturally, is because individuals are only interacting with law enforcement when they're making arrests, when they're arresting their family members, when they're looking for people, and so all of those interactions are negative.
Right.
And the difference in these experiences, for example, with white communities, is generally what we tend to see is that white communities have more positive interactions with law enforcement. And that is, if we're talking about like middle class communities, law enforcement, are not necessarily patrolling those communities in the same ways, for a lot of different reasons, right? Maybe it is class based, right? And so we tend to see upper income communities. There's not necessarily a need for a high police presence, right? And these predominantly tend to be white communities. And so when white individuals are interacting with law enforcement, it's generally in more positive ways. And so they don't necessarily have these negative views, right?
Well, I want to disagree with you that a little
Okay.
bit, because what I'll say is what they see in my perspective is that they see the officers in those communities as they're there to protect them.
Right.
Those officers
Yeah.
are driving around to protect me. In the lower income community, those officers are there to arrest me.
Yeah, so class difference, right? So
Yes.
within the white population, I would agree, lower income white individuals do have more negative views with law enforcement, or more negative views towards law enforcement, because they have more negative interactions, because poverty, right?
Correct.
When you have poverty, you tend to have higher crime, right? And we're not saying that, income, like upper income don't commit crime. We're just saying that when we talk about interactions with law enforcement, lower income communities across the board, regardless of race, tend to have more negative interactions with law enforcement, more contact with law enforcement. And so even within white communities, upper income white communities have more positive interactions because they see officers there to protect them, to serve them, because they have those positive interactions. Whereas lower income white communities, they have more contact with regard to arrest and surveillance and things like that. With communities of color, historically, they've claimed that law enforcement, over police them, over surveil them, and that is one of the contributing factors to these negative interactions. I think that, some people claim that Black and brown communities have higher crime rates because they commit more crimes, but there's all of these different factors that go into this. But when we talk about racial and cultural trauma in policing, what we're talking about is across history, Black and brown folks have had negative interactions in higher numbers with law enforcement for myriad reasons. And we're not necessarily getting into the reasons why. It's just more about, because of those negative interactions, they have more hostility, they have greater tension for reasons related to trauma, right? So individuals are, dealing with fight, flight, freeze, fawn, whatever it may be. And, in a lot of those interactions that these individuals are going into with law enforcement, there's already an elevation, right? And then law enforcement responds, right? If you're in those situations. And so it becomes a very tense situation. So you said that you're talking about it, that you're having conversations about it. Do you develop any kind of protocols when dealing with communities that have had longstanding negative interactions with law enforcement, that maybe it's not necessarily interactions with St. Pete, but just, throughout history, throughout time?
Yeah, and like I said, but I only can speak for St. Pete and places where I worked. And I looked at it, and I talked about one episode called Park, Walk, and Talk. where instead of an officer, he or she's making an arrest, to park their car, walk and talk to people in the community. Because again, only time you're going to see an officer in the community of black and brown is they're driving in, they're taking a police report, they're arresting someone, or they're there for a crime and then they're leaving. So therefore, that's all negative. So
Mhm.
why not get out of your car and let me meet those people? Because you're
Mhm.
only dealing with 2% of the community if you're dealing with 911 calls. What about the other 98%? So we talk about, how do you change that? How do you let people see the other side? And the only way you're going to see that is by communication. If I'm only talking to you during a crisis, then I'm going to identify you with a crisis and with a negative part of that, because you only
Mhm.
come to me when there's something negative happening to my life.
Yeah.
So how do you break that cycle? The only way you can break that cycle is by communicating.
Mhm.
And that's hard, because those officers also come into, someone's going to say, you know what, you're patrolling the projects. So everything you read about the project, everything you read about that community, you're coming in
Mhm.
with a negative attitude also, that everybody in that community is like the 2% that you deal with.
Mhm.
So again, it comes down to that communication, because there's trauma on both sides. The officer, he or she's experienced trauma because every time they go in that area, something happens to them or someone gets hurt, and the community feels the
Mhm.
same way. So it's like, okay, it doesn't happen all the time. And that's the thing you got to say.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen, but everybody, it does happen every day. So you have to finally say, did it happen today? No. Did it
Mhm.
happen yesterday? No. Oh, it happened 3 months ago. So
Mhm.
in 3 months, it happened to you once.
Yeah. And you bring up a really good point when we talk about racial and cultural trauma in policing. It's on both sides,
Yes.
right? So when law enforcement are repeatedly responding to calls for service or repeatedly interacting with members of the community, and they are a member of a particular group, it is really hard to combat those negative interactions, right?
Mhm.
If they're not equally having the same amount of positive interactions with members of those communities, it begins to build up this kind of bias where kind of have experience. Well, in my experience, right? Because we're
Mhm.
experts in our own experience, right? So, in my experience, you know, these individuals are, participating in this activity. And it's difficult, right?
Right.
We hope that that doesn't happen. But in the grand scheme of when we're talking about the experiences that we have as individuals, everything that we do is rooted in previous experience in the ways that we respond. And so if law enforcement are consistently interacting with communities of color, right? And that is the dominant interactions that they're having, it does imprint on them. It does affect their thought processes and the ways that they go about interacting with people and the expectations that they have coming into situations, especially when maybe these are the same individuals that they've worked with before, right?
Correct.
And so, and we've talked in previous episodes about the work that law enforcement do with regard to implicit bias and kind of trying to unpack that and undo that. But we're talking about the trauma that comes from that, right? Just the fact that historically this has been not just one law enforcement experience,
Right.
but a lot of law enforcement officers' experiences with these particular communities. And so it becomes very, very difficult to keep that viewpoint of this is one event, this is not all.
Right, but that one event has been placed into their memory, so to speak, by television and other things. So therefore, it's going to happen all the time. I see sometime where some people of color will only talk to a white officer because the way that white officer has treated them with respect.
Mm,
So it can be done both ways, but at the same time, though, like I said, that trauma is like is passed down. Well,
mhm,
every time I've had contact with a police officer, this is what happened to me.
mhm,
So that just spreads and spreads, and then again reverse on the same side. Every time I've had contact with somebody in that community, this is what happened to me.
right.
So it's like, how do we get there? How do we? And it's going to happen, but
Mhm,
take that small part of that negative and deal with that positive part.
right.
And it's hard, because you're asking someone 22, 23 that's been raised in a different community, different area, and now I'm
Yeah.
going to dump you into an area you've never been before in your life, and all I
Mhm,
come with is my experience,
right.
what I know.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point too. Like you're talking about an officer who's 23, 24 years old, and say, for example, they've, only grown up in a predominantly white community, have had very little interaction with other cultures, with with communities of color, right? And then all of the sudden, their calls for service, it's just every single one is a community of color or a community that is multicultural or a different culture than them. It's really, really difficult, right,
Right.
to keep that viewpoint of, well, in this particular example, white individuals commit crimes too. White individuals do things too. And it's not just communities of color. It's not just, multicultural communities or communities of different cultural backgrounds than me. It's difficult, right?
Well, and I want to say is also is inside that culture. I grew up in Tampa, but I started my career in Clearwater, and I still remember because I laughed at my field training officer because I'm black, of course. So they assigned me to a black community, and that day he drove me around, and he's at the end of the day they always ask you questions. He says, "Well, what did you think about the project area we went through?" I said, "What projects?" He says, "We went through the project 4 times. You better know where that project area is because that's going to be make or break your career." I said, okay. So the next day we drove around again. He says, "Okay, where's the projects?" I says, "Sir, I know it's a trick question. You haven't put me in the projects."
Mhm.
So he finally took me, it was an apartment complex. So
Mm.
let me take you over to Tampa so you can see what the projects look like. And those are high-rise building but in his mind, that's what it was. So he came with a bias and
Right.
he was African American.
Yeah.
So again, like you're saying, so that was the negative part where he was thinking that was the roughest to me. That was like, God, I would love to live in this neighborhood, you know, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I just think over time is just, and you're right when you say it is what did my grandparents go through, my great it is we always pass information down to
Yeah.
one generation to the
Mhm.
next, but at some point, where are we going to say, okay, let's not listen to media, let's understand that happened
Mhm.
when we're looking at history and stuff like that, but
Mhm.
how do we move from there to the present?
Yeah. So I want to ask you a personal question. So, you know, growing up as a child and a member of the African American community, do you remember messages that your parents communicated to you about law enforcement?
No, and it was kind of funny because, like I said, back then in the 70s, the law enforcement officers were getting back into the black community. I remember the 2 officers in our community that 2 white officers, they could take their gun belts off and play basketball with us, and no one better
Mm,
not touch them because those were our officers.
right.
Don't touch them. So I don't remember that. I remember it was kind of funny because I relate that to the sundown rule. If you
Hmm.
remember, black
Yeah.
people had to be home by sundown.
Yeah.
And I never used to understand why mom used to always tell me, you better be home before sundown because
Mm,
nothing happens good after sundown.
yeah.
Or, they used to say street lights,
Mm,
be home before the street lights come on.
mm-hmm.
But that was her culture that
Yeah.
don't be out at night because if the cops catch you out at night, they're going to assume that you're doing something bad.
Mm, yeah.
So therefore, it was kind of scary, so to speak. Now I go think about it is so in my culture or my community, there were like no African Americans moving around after dark,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and it was just like nothing good happens after dark.
Right.
So whether it was related to law enforcement or related to the community, it was just like you just don't be out at
Yeah.
night.
So do you kind of feel like you had a positive view of law enforcement growing up?
I think I had a very again, that's why I'm in law enforcement. I had a very positive. I can think about my school resource officer uh, that kind of like pushed me toward law enforcement. He was a white guy. It was a contact. It was
Mhm.
just, but then, like I said, and I'm part of that problem because I
Mhm.
saw that when crack came along, we changed. We all of a sudden we went from 100 miles an hour to community policing to we got to make arrests.
Mhm.
We were starting to get into communities, and we again, like I said, one of your episodes was just like we had to solve a problem,
Mhm. Yeah.
and that problem was arrest everybody that's selling crack.
So I'm going to ask you the same question. So growing up, what were the messages about law enforcement that were kind of communicated to you maybe by your parents or, just people in your circle?
Honestly, there wasn't a lot of communication. Like I didn't see cops around a lot. Like if my mom was driving the car, you might see a cop car just kind of drive past you, but there was no like outward like anything whatsoever. Like my mom's like, those are the cops, you can trust them, like all of that. Probably wasn't until 2020 that any like people started like I actually started learning about anything.
Mm-hmm.
My mom was always just like, you can trust them, they're the cops. And that was that. I didn't interact whatsoever with them until like high school.
Okay. So I'm going to ask myself the same question because I find that interesting. And I think I have a follow-up question, but I'm going to give you my answer first. So I grew up in extreme poverty. And I think that that's relevant because I think that that has shaped the messages that were communicated to me about law enforcement. And those messages were that you can't trust law enforcement, that they're out to get you, right? And so that was kind of the messaging that I got from one parent, right? The other parent was you have to be in fear of law enforcement, right?
Mhm.
And so if I think about my two parents and knowing who they are, the one who didn't trust them and didn't like them had quite a bit of interactions with law enforcement, okay? The other one who was in fear of them didn't have interactions with law enforcement other than the witnessing of the interactions with the other parent. Trying to not out my parents here, but I think largely that the experience of poverty is what shaped
Right.
their viewpoints, right? And I don't necessarily know that I would say that I adopted all of those things. Those were just the messages that were communicated. And so I guess my follow-up for you is, and you don't have to be extremely specific, but you can be kind of vague. So I said that I grew up in extreme poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that you had a similar experience in terms of that? Or would you say that you disagree, like you didn't grow up in extreme poverty?
I grew up in a more of a middle to higher class.
Okay.
My mother worked in like an IT, so it was a very business job. She made good money. She got good child support from my dad. And but like, yeah, no, I did not grow up in poverty
Right.
whatsoever. Like if I could point to something like, "Mom, can I get that?" She would say yes. My
Okay.
grandparents would say, "Yeah, let's go get it." Like everyone, I
Right.
did not grow up in extreme poverty whatsoever.
And so I think that
Mhm.
what shapes those interactions. And I also think that your interaction and your views are shaped largely by what you kind of pointed out about what law enforcement looked like at that time, right? And that they were really focused on being a part of the community. And you mentioned, they would take their belts off and nobody would mess with it because those were your law enforcement people, right?
Yes.
And you largely you trusted them. And I think that it was interesting also that because the sundown laws you
Yes.
mentioned, right? A lot of the conversation that people are having and that people take issue with when we think about historically, the communities of color view the sundown laws as a law enforcement initiative, right? But really, that was a law that came from somewhere else. Law enforcement were required to enforce it,
Yes.
right? And so I find that interesting that while it was a part of your life, right? And your mom said, be home before sundown or before the street lights come on, right? And you knew that nothing good happened at dark, right? You didn't necessarily view it as the agenda of law enforcement to police you.
I didn't realize that until probably about 10 years ago. I think I was watching a show and it was something I was watching like, oh, that's where that came from.
Right.
But other
Yeah.
than that, like my whole life, I didn't. It was just like, but then I was like, that's where
Yeah.
she got that from.
Yeah. And I find that evolution over time, right? That it's become now that law enforcement did this, right? Um, has, like gotten muddied because if you think back, this was a law that was not initiated by law enforcement.
Correct.
It was just that law enforcement were responsible for enforcing it by nature of the duties that they have.
And we talked about one of your podcasts is just people understand we only enforce the laws that are on the books. So
Mhm.
therefore, we're just following what we're told to do to a
Right.
point.
Yeah.
And like earlier when you were talking, the thing that I know a lot of, I should say 99% of law enforcement officers hate when someone brings their kid up to them and says, if you do something bad, they're going to take you to jail. You just put a negative part to my career, to
Yeah.
that kid. If you're bad, he or she's going to take you away.
Yeah. For sure.
And
Yeah.
parents do that all the time, and it drives me crazy.
Yeah. And we talked about it. We
See?
talked about it a lot. Your parents do that? Did they?
My dad did. He
Yeah.
was like, hey, like whenever like you hear the cop sirens, like we were like eating dinner, you hear cop sirens, oh, they're coming to get you. Did you do something? What'd you do? And I like when I was little, I freaked out about it.
So you say earlier, it's traumatized. So when you hear sirens, you get a little nervous, right? Heart starts beating a little bit faster.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's more that was definitely when I was younger, but since I went to high school, I went to Pinellas Park High School, so they had the first responder magnet program and the criminal justice program. So that's when I actually started interacting more with police officers, with everyone. So then now whenever I hear a siren, I'm like, ooh, what's happening? Someone tell me what's happening.
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, like people are doing a lot of disservice to law enforcement. We, like don't think too well about, I think that it's definitely something that we need to educate people more about. If we want to be able to trust law enforcement, we have to control the narratives that we put out. And we also have to, I think that leads us to this place where we really need to have more conversations about things, because I think in the grand scheme of things, law enforcement take the heat for a lot of things that are not law enforcement responsibilities, or we don't necessarily understand. Like we've talked about things across a lot of different episodes, and largely, we're saying, well, this was just a directive given to law enforcement and we just had to be the face of it, right? Or, well, yes, we use that particular gear, but they think it's for something that we don't use it for, right?
Correct.
We use it for protective, and they're saying we're using it, to hurt people, and that's not what's going on. And I think that we don't have enough of conversations where we hear from law enforcement. And I think that largely that's one of the biggest issues that we're getting into, is other people are in charge of controlling the narrative with what's going on in the public that involve law enforcement. And while they might invite you to the meeting, they just want to report, or they want to ask you the questions that they have, and there's not ever an opportunity for them for law enforcement to say, here's the issues and the challenges that we're facing, and these are the requests that we have from the community, and this is what's going on. It's, why did you do this, and are you going to hold those people responsible, really?
And I agree with that. Like I say, we're just enforcing or following directive that the community or the state has decided on. That's what they want to put in place. A lot of people, well, you cops came with this law. We didn't come with this law. The community as a whole said we want to feel safer, or we want to be protected. So therefore, to be safe or to be protected, we need this law put in place. And law enforcement, you need to carry out our directive.
And I think that really, I think that this is so huge, because a lot of people are angry about the history of policing, right? And so they're angry that at law enforcement, right?
Right.
They're angry at law enforcement because law enforcement was created to enforce, you know, or what the slave patrols created law enforcement, right? But they forget or they don't understand that this came from the public.
Correct.
The people said, we need a body of people to go and enforce this. We need a body of people to go and track down these individuals. Law enforcement didn't exist before this, and law enforcement didn't say, this is why we're creating ourselves.
Correct.
And when we really hear that, to me, that leads us to really understanding that blame has been placed unfairly and that has deteriorated trust with the police and the community unfairly. And we have been blinded by misinformation, by not understanding, and it has created the negative interactions that these communities have had with law enforcement and that law enforcement have had with these communities because it's rooted in falsehoods, right?
Right.
There's no doubt that slave patrols were created.
Correct.
There's no doubt that slave patrols were created for this very particular purpose. There's no doubt that there was a series of events that occurred throughout law enforcement history that caused a lot of racial and cultural trauma.
I agree.
The problem lies in that people are misunderstanding that law enforcement created these. These came from the public and they came from government, which are the public, right?
Yes. Mhm.
And law enforcement were tasked, and like we've had similar conversations, with doing the dirty work.
Totally agree with you.
And then unfairly being judged, right? And so when we begin to kind of think about this in that context, I mean, for me, it's like, okay, now we can kind of exhale. And now we can have conversations and understand with law enforcement and law enforcement interactions, these individuals are doing a job that the community has given to them. So now maybe we need to reevaluate community needs.
Agree.
So it helps us to really kind of unpack the racial and cultural trauma that these communities have experienced that, in my opinion, is rooted in inaccuracy, in falsehoods, and it allows us to open up our lens and understand more completely where we need to shift our attention, right? Instead of attacking law enforcement, we need to go back to the drawing board and say, what can we do to work towards improving these relationships and then building that trust in communities between law enforcement and the members of the community, but also developing these policies and procedures that align with the needs of the communities in better ways so that we can create safer interactions.
Totally agree. 100%.
So then what can we do from law enforcement? I know that it takes both, right? But what can law enforcement do to help alleviate tensions in these interactions when we can recognize that, hey, these people are, obviously, these individuals are obviously, impacted by things that have happened with their interactions with law enforcement. What can law enforcement do to kind of alleviate this tension?
Going to go back to having those tough conversations and then explaining why you're enforcing the laws that you are enforcing. And again, I always go back to crack cocaine. When I was going up through my career, there was a person on every street corner, just about in the African American community, selling crack. So, and it wasn't, and you said it quite well, it wasn't law enforcement was looking. It was the people in the community were calling, saying, "Hey, get this person off my corner because they're selling crack. People are shooting at each other. My kids can't play in the street." And I can go on and on and on.
Mhm.
So it's like sometimes we in law enforcement fail to communicate to people why we're enforcing the laws that we're enforcing, why we're doing what we're doing. That Tony Holloway doesn't come today and says, "I want to put all my tactical people on the street." That decision was made by listening from input from the community, by looking at crime trends. Everything is put together, not to say that we're going to put all the law enforcement officers in this community. We're putting law enforcement officers in this community because, and then show them the data.
Mhm.
And I've made that mistake in my life where I showed the community arrest data. Well, I created the arrest data.
Mhm.
Why don't I show them the call for services? Show them the complaints?
Yeah.
Because if I'm showing them the arrest data, all I'm doing is showing them that I made arrests.
Right. Yeah.
Why don't I show them where I'm getting all these phone calls where people are complaining about people selling drugs, where people are complaining about people shooting in the community? Now you can say, you know what? Now I know why he's here.
Yeah. Yeah. And that you bring up a really good point, because when we start talking about policing, the calls for service are what drives policing,
Correct.
right? And so when, and you mentioned, crack cocaine and the crack epidemic, and, a lot of people claim, so during that time, we declared a war on drugs,
Yes.
right? It was taking over these communities.
And people are being killed.
Yeah, people were dying, people were being killed, and it was, a really serious epidemic that was going on and that was spreading across our country. And people were asking for law enforcement to do something, right?
Mhm.
And law enforcement responded. And you also bring up another good point. You created arrest data, right? You created arrest data, right? So you arrest people for the things that they're doing that are violating the law, and then the data becomes present. You you can't arrest, like, you're not arresting people that aren't doing things,
Correct.
right? And so people kind of forget, and then they want to make up things and say, well, like, he wasn't doing anything, he didn't have anything, and to me that's perplexing. I mean, maybe there's an instance here and there, law enforcement, something, whatever, who knows, you know but in the grand scheme, like, they're arresting individuals that are violating laws.
Right.
And we know this to be true because, one, when law enforcement show up to things and people haven't violated laws, people are getting arrested.
Correct.
And we can see that in some of our conversations that we've had where, maybe a parent calls and they're asking for help, and, law enforcement come, and then there's nothing no law's been violated, and they can't arrest anybody. So they don't arrest anybody, right?
Correct.
So we see this happening, right? But when communities of color are impacted by these things and law enforcement are asked to respond, and then they respond, then communities say that they're being targeted or they're being over policed.
But you got to, and it's, but we're coming because you have called us, because you have reported a crime, and therefore we're coming into the community to try to solve that crime, not try to solve the problem, try to
Right.
solve the crime. And if we can find the root cause, and that's it. And let me back a little bit, like you said, the crack epidemic. People weren't calling really about people selling crack. They were calling about all the homicides, all the
Mm,
shootings, and they wanted that to stop.
mm,
And the cause of the homicides and the shooting was the sale of crack cocaine because there was so much money being made.
mhm,
So, and I like what you said. So when we create these arrests, it's not like the officer's knocking on your door and says, "I'm going to arrest you for child abuse." someone called us, someone put us in that location
Yeah.
to investigate a crime that you reported.
Yeah, and I would say, and let me know if you agree, most of your interactions develop from calls for service.
100%.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase it. Most of our arrests are from when people call us in. That's
Right.
99.9%.
Yeah. So it's very little that you're, driving around or, doing some type of surveillance and you actually make an arrest in those moments. There's some,
Right.
but the majority of the arrests that are made come from a call for service.
And we're doing that surveillance because if you go back, someone has called and let us know that at B Street and C Street, that's where they're selling drugs and that's where all the problems are. So therefore, we're going to do surveillance on that street corner because we received information that a crime is occurring or has occurred there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it really, like when we talk about these ideas of over policing communities or, being more strict with certain populations and the resulting trauma that occurs with these interactions generationally, right? While it's valid, while we understand that increased interactions with law enforcement and involvement in the justice system definitely impacts people in very, very challenging ways, we have to really start to unpack why law enforcement are there.
Yes.
Right? And the reasons why law enforcement are there and work towards rebuilding and building trust in those relationships so that we can get to these places where individuals are not coming into these interactions with law enforcement on both sides, are not coming into interactions with individuals with aggression, with tension, with already heightened awareness, right? So that we can have more positive outcomes.
Totally agree.
I feel we're talking, there's the police and the community. There's two sides that are meeting in the middle. So like we're talking about things that police officers can do, but there's also things that the community can do. Like this podcast is like for educational purposes, and this education I feel like is one of the biggest things because I didn't start paying attention to a lot of stuff happening until 2020 when it was just everything was negative. Everything was horrible. And that honestly, I thought I had those, I thought like that for a while until I came to college to like my senior year of high school where everyone's like, no, you need to learn the background of everything. And then when learning all of this stuff that I'm learning now is like, yeah, that's just the media. The media was taking the interesting parts of the story and putting it out there. And that shaped my perception of what I thought police officers as a whole was.
Yeah.
And so just like those perceptions of like things in history, things like the slave patrol, things like Stonewall, or like all of that stuff shapes what people think. And then, but as soon as you learn like that's history, like that happened, but we're trying to move past it, is just, I feel like that's like the thing that everybody just needs to do.
Yeah, and there's also other factors that are not communicated in those messages. Like, yeah, I understand the media should report on things,
100. Yeah.
right? Like we need to know. I mean, I don't know. I would kind of debunk that or break that down a little bit. Like, I don't necessarily think we need to know everything, but we do need to be well versed in what's going on in our community, our country. But when you only have one narrative, that's where the problem lies, right? So we don't have the information. And I've said before, there's 3 sides to every story: your side, my side, and the truth, right? And what we tend to get is the media is giving us their version. We don't get law enforcement's version. We don't, I mean, sometimes we get the versions of individuals, but even then, we're talking like 1 or 2 people that they get on there, and they always pick the most comical person to put on there. I mean, I can think about plenty of times like tornadoes that occurred in Arkansas, and the person that they interview, it's like reinforcing the stereotype of what an Arkansan is, right?
Yes.
They're like missing teeth, and they, not completely clothed, or they're barefoot, or they can't speak, right? Like, so they always pick the one individual that maybe doesn't necessarily represent the whole, but we're talking about in the grand scheme of an event, one or two people and their voice and their narrative. And almost never do we get, and I use this term, I don't know, loosely, but the real law enforcement narrative.
I'll agree and disagree with you a little bit. I would love to have, and media does a great job. Like I said, we need them. I would love to have a media outlet that covers all three, but we
For
know
sure.
that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But and the way I look at it is, doesn't Hollywood tell us what we're going to do, how we're going to dress, and what needs to be covered? Covered, because as we look, we wait for a certain movie to come out, or we wait for a certain TV show to come, and we're glued to that, and then that's
It
reality for
dictates
us.
everything. Yeah.
And then therefore, if we're
Yeah.
watching that, then the media thinks that's where it's all about money. Okay, let's be honest, and that's what's going to draw. And I need those viewerships. So I would love, because, and I do it. I'll watch one channel for an hour to see what they're saying. Then I'll watch another channel for another hour. I go like, it's like, am I in the same universe?
Yeah.
Because they were talking, like you said, it could be that same story about what our officer did, but one station is going it one way and one station is going the other. Like,
Yeah.
now can somebody do the middle?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, we definitely, we don't get the full picture. And I think that is a disservice in our community, and to us as humans, because like you mentioned, like you're not necessarily aware that you're getting like a distorted version. You just think that, well, this is on TV, like this is what's happening.
The thing that everyone's talking about.
Yeah,
Right.
the thing, it's like you get blindsided almost, like, oh wait, there's more sides to this, there's other facts. And often you'll hear people, like I hear people a lot critique law enforcement, like they shouldn't have done that and they shouldn't have done that, and I'm like, well, have you thought about what that individual, like they just threw a water bottle at them? What would you do? Like, and there's a lot of times like you see law enforcement that are extremely stoic. They're just, statues. And I'm thinking, I could not do that. Like, somebody throws a water bottle at me to just stand there, right? It's a terrible game that law enforcement have to play, because they're not allowed to be human, but they're expected to be human. And the second they become human, they're criticized for being human.
You said that quite well, so thank you. I can't add anything on to it, because you're right, because that's what everybody expects. This I want you to be that right now, but 2 minutes I want you to be this,
Yeah,
and then bring you back to this.
absolutely. But we miss it, right? This, we get caught up in, and I think that's kind of the challenge that we have with media, especially like short form, right? It's just you swipe up, you just keep going and keep going and keep going, and before long you've consumed like 300 videos on the same thing, and nobody can tell you anything different because you've seen it, right?
It's
but
true.
Yeah, but to sit down and have an hour conversation about a topic, well, nobody wants to do that. That takes too much time, and I'll consume it in these short little pieces, and then you miss the majority of the facts that are going on. And, like you mentioned, you watch an hour of this one and then an hour of that one, and it's like, is this the same thing? Like, how did they spin it this way and spin it that way? And we do a disservice because we don't have a checks and balance system.
Totally agree.
We're so focused on this constitutional right to, a free press. And we forget that there needs to be some checks and balances. We're not just talking about adults. We're also talking about children and the way that it impacts them, and all of these messages about law enforcement that are put out there, right? And there's no checks and balances. And we're not saying wash it, right? We're not saying whitewash this. We're not saying cleanse it. We're saying, can we please have real information that's not distorted, right? That's not biased, that's not got a slant, because we're really doing a lot of harm, not just to law enforcement, not just to our communities, but to members of certain communities. We're doing a lot of harm. Even the communication that we have about what it means to be a criminal. Who is criminal, right? Because largely what our media has done and the public has supported is criminalized Black and brown bodies, right? We've criminalized multicultural bodies. We've criminalized bodies of different religions. We've criminalized immigrant bodies, right? Through our media. And we've used law enforcement as a conduit to do that.
Good.
And it is damaging not just our community, but law enforcement. And it's preventing law enforcement from being able to do their job in the way that they need to, because they're dealing with the ramifications of this. And it seems like we have a lot of work.
But I think like through podcasts and through educating people, uh, that way they can hear the other side and instead of being blasted with just the same thing, because you need to hear both sides.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
You need to hear all sides, right? And I think that it's extremely important if we're going to work on kind of rebuilding that trust in those communities with law enforcement, that we have those conversations. And this is, the reason why we're doing this.
Correct.
Well, thank y'all for joining me today. This is Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we talk about trauma responsive practices and building criminal justice reform.